Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to week 4 of Harlan to Hogan's Alley. And we're going to be looking at James Baldwin today. So, James Baldwin, a clear black writer from the US, born in 1924, and he died in 1987. And just to say, this is going to be a slightly shorter kind of introduction from me, because the main part of the sort of lecture workshop, I want you to watch the debate with James Baldwin that I'll explain later on. So Baldwin is born in New York in 1924, but he spends the majority of his life in Europe, and he's talked about this a lot as being a place where he just felt safer and more comfortable. So that's why he kind of moved to Europe. His first novel, Go Tell It to the Mountain, was finished in 1952. But then in the sort of 1950s, he was really an active participant in the civil rights movement. He made many trips to the south of the United States, including to places like Selma, and he met Martin Luther King. His third novel, Another Country, which I'd highly recommend, was published in 1962. And on May 25th, 1963, he led the civil rights demonstration in Paris. And he also participated in the biggest kind of march on Washington on August 28th. So the collection of short stories that we're going to be looking at this week, Going to Meet the Man, was published in 1965. And that's also the year where he debated William F. Buckley at Cambridge University, which is what we're going to be watching during the lecture today. And he died in France in 1987. So, as you may have guessed from the timeline, we're now entering into the civil rights era. And this is just quite a useful timeline for the progress of the civil rights movement from 1954 to 1968, which is kind of the peak of this time. So the first major date here is Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, which was a Supreme Court ruling that found that school segregation was unconstitutional. And this kind of overruled an earlier ruling, Plessy versus Ferguson, which had established the separate but equal principle, but this Brown versus the Board of Education kind of overruled that. And that was the first steps towards desegregation in the South. So you've then got a number of key events in the late 1950s, including the Montgomery bus boycott, so that's Rosa Parks, and many activists after her who boycotted public buses. You've then got desegregation that begins around 1957 with Little Rock, which you might have heard of, where the National Guard had to go in to protect a young girl and 9 black students attending the first desegregated school in that area. Then in the early 1960s, you've got a variety of sit-in campaigns, so that's students, mainly in universities, but also different forms of educational institution, secondary schools and colleges. Students sitting across the country, staging sit-ins to protest the segregation of restaurants. So that is going and sitting in restaurants. So these are all forms of really active protest. So that's actually physically going and doing something in person. You then in 1961 got the Freedom Rides, which are another very interesting form of direct action where volunteers travelled around the South by bus in an attempt to desegregate bus terminals. And then you've got a series of big protests in the 1960s. So the Birmingham protests, where Martin Luther King was actually jailed. Then you've got the March on Washington, crucially, where nearly 200,000 people marched on Washington, and that's where you get Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. So 1964 is the year where the Civil Rights Act is passed. So that's a really key date. And the Civil Rights Act is the act that outlawed discrimination on the basis of race, colour, religion, sex, or national origin, and required equal access to public places and employment, and enforced desegregation of schools and the right to vote. So that's the really key piece of legislation here that, essentially ends segregation in the southern United States. So then you've got Malcolm X assassinated in 1965, and we're going to talk much more about Malcolm X next week. We've got other forms of protest and attack, including the Bloody Sunday Montgomery protests and Selma. If you've seen the film Selma, that's worth watching. And you've also got the Voting Rights Act, which allowed Black voter registration levels to increase. And if you look at what's happening in the United States right now with voter suppression of Black communities, this is still an ongoing problem. And then in 1968, Martin Luther King is assassinated. So that's a very rough history of the civil rights period during this time. And this is all the period where sort of James Baldwin's also at his peak in terms of his writing and also his fame in the United States particularly. So Baldwin himself was very active in the civil rights movement, and he was an advocate for civil rights for Black people. And he spoke up and down the United States and visited many universities, giving speeches and talks, and was also a public intellectual in that he was on television quite frequently, on the radio. He became quite a well-established figure during this period. So this is a picture of him. He participated in the March on Washington and the March from Selma to Montgomery, and he was also in Cambridge in 1965. So he travelled around a lot. That was kind of part of what he wanted to do to spread the message, was to travel around and speak to different interested parties. So now we've just got this quote from The Fire Next Time from Baldwin, which I think is important to think about in relation to the short stories that we're going to read this week. So it says, hatred, which could destroy so much, never failed to destroy the man who hated, and this was an immutable law. So you can see one of the things that Baldwin is exceptional at is kind of reversing the gaze, the white gaze, and putting it back upon itself. So he's putting that emphasis back on the white man who hated. So what I would like you to do for the remaining time is to watch the debate between Baldwin and Buckley at Cambridge in 1965. It's about an hour long, so watch that on YouTube, and I'll put the link up. It's there as well. And I want you to think about these questions as the two individuals are making their case and having this debate. So the first question is, how does the positionality of each man impact his answer or his answers throughout? And Baldwin's really amazing at the way he sort of introduces himself and his own positionality. What is the strength and power in Baldwin's argument? What does Buckley's reply kind of reveal about conservative resistance to the civil rights movement? So what can we tell from Buckley's reply about how this argument has been framed in the United States at this time? And I think also we can think about how these two contrary positions, so Baldwin or Buckley, how do they actually translate in Baldwin's work? So can we see any of these kinds of arguments and thoughts in Baldwin's short stories for this week as well? So watch the debate. It's quite intense, so you can pause it and think through things. And if you get to answer these questions along the way, that would be great. And I will see you in our seminars this week.